This is one of those, and now for something completely different sort of situations. What I want to do maybe first, so I know a number of you in the audience. It's been great catching up with some of you, but I want to go to the end before I go to the beginning. So now you get to see all my slides before I come back here. So I wrote this book. It's free. You can scan the QR code and get it for free and read it. It's made free by the Norwegian government, which paid for a lot of the research on ethical leadership in conflict and crisis. And the idea is that over the last 15 years or so, I've studied, along with my colleague Jason McLeon and Tim Fort from Indiana University, studied how do senior leadership, so C-suite executives, manage conflict and crisis, and how do they try to do so in ways that are, in their perception, ethical. And what we figured out are things that I think will seem very obvious to those of you in the room, given the conversations we've been having today, but I think need to be repeated enough for this group for two reasons. One, for those of you at the senior executive level, it's a nice reminder of the things that work and the things that don't work so well. At the same time, for those of you not at the senior executive level, maybe at the operational level or even at the tactical level, it's a nice way of talking to your senior leadership about the ways to respond to the crises that we find ourselves in. So I thought I'd put that up first, so this way everyone could read the book while I'm talking, and that takes all the pressure off me from talking because you're all going to be in your phones now for the next 18 minutes and 32 seconds. I do that trick with my students all the time. So some of you have this, sort of these, this is my joke version of the KPI mapping frameworks and data visualizations that all of you have. And for many of you, it just says it's red, right? Alert all the time. We have a climate crisis, there's wars, we have economic inequality and tariffs, we've got social uprisings, we've got energy problems, water problems, health crises, you name it, we have things going on all at the same time. What our research has found is that this situation of having to deal with multiple crises at the same time, which academics call polycrisis, is not going away anytime soon. In fact, we expect it to last for the next couple of decades. The good news, bad news, right? So the bad news for society is that now we're into a time of upheaval. The good news for all of you is you will not be, I don't think, replaced by AI anytime soon, because as there are crisis after crisis, usually security professionals are in need. So good, again, good news, bad news. What our research has found routinely is that leadership in polycrisis, so from leaders who have done this before, isn't really about prediction. So I'm sorry for the consultants in the room who sell predictive models and services. I apologize for that. But it isn't making it through it and surviving and thriving in the face of polycrisis is not really about prediction. Instead, it's about preparation. Okay, there's a slight distinction. So you're not going to predict accurately whether the next crisis happens on January 14th, 2026. Don't try to do that. And anyone selling you that kind of product, don't buy their product. Instead, what you can do is, and I think, again, many of those of you in the room know this already because of your experience, instead you can prepare, right? You can bolster systems, you can get ready. So what I'll walk through is a little bit about what we found at the strategic level, at the operational level, and at the tactical level about what works and how those align, and then how that misalignment can cause lots of problems. Every company claims to be ethical. I don't think there's a single company out there that claims to do unethical things. Everyone would love to be ethical leaders. There's a couple of things, though, that we have to take into account. The first is what the famous management scholar Peter Drucker talked a lot about, and that empirical evidence has shown repeatedly, culture eats strategy for breakfast. So very early on today, we heard about the importance of corporate culture. I can't stress enough how clear of a result this is from the empirical literature. If you have certain types of cultures, they will react certain types of ways. And by this, I mean organizational culture. Organizational culture is largely driven by leaders. Right, so ethics are also upstream of culture. Okay, what that means is that whatever your values are as a company, right, a lot of which is rooted in the individuals that make up the company, are going to define the kind of culture that you have. I don't think I've said anything so far that's that radical. I think everybody would be generally on board with this. But that means that before the strategy fails, the ethics will fail. Right, so these two together implicitly mean that you're going to have ethical failings. You're going to see ethical failings before the strategy fails, right? So if there are ethical failings, then it will lead to strategy failure, if that makes sense. Okay, so then we got to look at the strategic level. Some of you have seen something like this before, right? So those of you with a leadership background or a military background or who have an MBA may have seen this before, right? This idea that whatever we're doing at the strategic level should flow down and match what's happening at the operational level, which should support it, and then should flow down to the tactical level, which should support it. What our research has found is that if you want to do the right thing, however you conceive of that, if you want to lead in a values-based way, there's some things you have to do at the strategic level. Okay, stepping back a second, why would you want to lead in a values-based way anyway? What our research has consistently found is that those companies that are perceived of as being more value-driven and more in line with their own values, not necessarily with the community's values, are the ones that survive best through crisis and conflict. Okay, so that's the alignment here. At the strategic level, what we see is it's really about things we've talked about quite a bit today. Doing what you say and saying what you do, and doing that consistently for years on end builds up trust, right? That's a word we heard in the very first session, and that I think is a through line through today. Reciprocity, right? Making sure you are not perceived of as an organization as a taker. There's a lot of organizations that in the communities they operate in are perceived of purely as ones who extract. If you're perceived of in that way, guess what? Things will not go well for you when crisis hits in those communities. Right? It will be harder for you to manage through them. And then the link with all of this is real values. If you go to your company's website and you find a set of values that could apply to any company at any time in any industry, those are not real values. I don't know how else to put this. Many of the value statements on some of the companies in this room, in many companies' websites are designed by marketing departments, and they have no real significance or value in the organization. We found that that's a problem. And so probably the most interesting interviews that I've done are with CEOs who reflect on their failures and are able to say, if I could have done something differently, we would have communicated our values better, our real values, as opposed to those values that when the marketing department, when they got a hold of it, they turned it into a nice web page, right, and a nice document in the shareholder report, but it didn't really reflect who we were. Right? These are interlinked. So to be consistent, to have this reciprocity with communities, you also have to have the real values, right? So they're all linked together. And we found that you have to almost do them together. Right? You have to work with them together at the strategic level. Much of what we've been talking about today has been at this more operational level, right? So this operational level, what we've seen is something that, especially those of you in the extractive space might have heard of, this idea of the social license to operate. So everybody has to get their legal license to operate, fine. But there's this sense of having the community provide you with the right to operate. This is an implicit license rather than a piece of paper that a government official who may or may not have legitimacy themselves signs for you to be able to open your facility or run your operations, right? And that's linked with maintaining trust, right? So not just maintaining trust with the government official who you're dealing with, right? But maintaining trust with the community within which you're operating. Again, these three are going to function together. And that means also being values driven by those real values that are set up at the strategic level. So Khalid was up here a few panelists ago and made a great point about some things need to be top down. Right? So some of these strategic issues, especially things like real values, have to be communicated from the top. Okay, and then how does that translate then down to the tactical level? What we see is that the most effective means of doing this in crisis and conflict are through cross-sector partnerships, right? So making sure that the folks who are on the ground are engaging adequately with their partners in not just the non-governmental space and the governmental space, but also oftentimes with competitors. So we've heard from a few panelists, and I heard lots in the networking area, about folks always sort of looking around in the competitive landscape when they're in certain areas and saying, well, what are our competitors doing? Those sorts of partnerships are highly effective at the tactical level, right? They're effective in maintaining ethical outcomes and ethical leadership in conflict and crisis. This also means earning trust, again, through reciprocity. So at the ground level, making sure that the reciprocity is not just for the local indigenous leader, but is for everyone, right? Is for every member of the community. And then this is usually the hardest part for senior executives to be okay with, but often those of you in this room are the ones who are the most appreciative of it, really trying to give autonomy to the folks on the ground to proactively address and adapt to what they're seeing. Constrained by the values, okay, so there's values that are, again, real authentic values that are being communicated and that everyone's on board with, right? But making sure that those individuals on the ground have that autonomy. If they don't, the risk is, and again, I think we've heard this a lot today, the risk is that the strategy and operations will look great on paper, but then when they're actually enacted in practice, they won't work because the individuals on the ground are too constrained by what is meant to be an international standard, but in practice ends up falling apart at the ground level. Okay, so then how do we link all these together, right? So what's the alignment? The companies that are the best able to push through in the setting that we have now, right, in polycrisis settings, are the ones that have alignment. So at the strategic level, we should see the setting of direction and values. At the operational level, we should see a systems design and really reinforcement of a culture that leadership is trying to guide us to. And at the tactical level, we should be able to see people who are able to execute with integrity under pressure. Again, which I think is a theme we've talked about a lot through today. If these things are in alignment, then when you're actually getting to the tactical level, it should be very obvious to folks on the ground what to do. Where we've seen problems, right? So where in the, again, 1,000+ interviews I've done with C-suite executives who have been in conflict and crisis settings, where do we have failures? Often we have failures because we're not communicating real values, right? What our values actually are, right? Which I mentioned already. Oftentimes though, there's simply a misalignment. So the folks at HQ have an idea about what our values are supposed to be, and they simply don't sync up with the operational and the tactical realities. Right, so that means there's a disconnect between HQ or the strategic level and the other levels. The same can happen at the other levels, but that disconnect is the one that we most frequently see. Right, we see a disconnect between that strategic level and the operational and the tactical level. Okay, so the place to sort of come back to is to ask questions about your company and to ask questions of your company executives, right? You probably don't want to do this in public. Unless you're like me and you have tenure, you may not have the same job protection, so you probably want to do this, quietly. You want to ask, though, your team and you want to ask the people above you, are we a stabilizer in this crisis context? Are we a company that people are going to look to as the gold domino, right? Being able to stop or at least hold back the tide of worse consequences from polycrisis? Or are we a crisis multiplier? Do we actually make things worse? So is our presence in this particular location, is our presence globally actually making things worse because of the way we're designed? Right? So is our strategy simply misaligned with this? All right, how to be a stabilizer then, right? This is what I think most companies want to get at. Real community partnerships are part of it, and those real community partnerships have to be based on, again, real, authentically held values. Many of your companies, right, but lots of companies globally get into trouble all the time because they put out a political statement that doesn't really reflect what their values are, but reflects the pet priorities of a few people in the headquarters. But they don't actually match with everything else, right? So that's why this is linked with the second point of politics are sometimes necessary, but there's no need to engage with it unless it's necessary, right? And unless it's a reflection and a connection to the real, authentically held values of the company, right? Otherwise, it seems to be a distraction, right? And very often just a marketing tool again. People see through these, right? People see through them very quickly. And then finally is a concept that Taleb talks about a lot. If anyone's read Nicholas Nassim Taleb's Anti-Fragility, it's a concept he spends an entire book on. But the idea is simply that we want to create an organization that gets stronger because of polycrisis. Not one that is like a stone that's trying to beat off the different crises, but rather one that's able to deal with the crisis and actually emerge better and stronger and not just, again, survive like the rock, right, but actually thrive and grow as a result of polycrisis, because it's not going away. It's this polycrisis environment we're in is not going away. We've talked a lot today about AI. AI is just the next thing, right? So we're in an environment right now where, again, I can't stress enough, the crisis environment is not going away. It's not going to get better, right? And it's not going to get better for some time, which means our organizations have to try to be these stabilizers rather than multipliers. Okay, so I still have 4.5 minutes left. So if there are any questions, I'm always happy to field questions. I have a feeling everybody just wants to get coffee and get some more sweets and get out of here, but are there any questions? I'm like a university professor, so I always like questions. And no, everyone's like, just get on to the next thing, man. Okay, great. Look, I'll be here afterwards during the networking reception. I'm happy to talk to any of you. I am sort of between the UAE and Ireland, so if you're either in any of those two places, please feel free to reach out, and I'd love to have a cup of coffee. All right, thanks everybody.